All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's Scrum at Scale webinar presentation. My name is Alyssa Layden, and I'm the product owner of marketing for Scrum at Scale LLC. Before introducing today's guest, I would like to cover just a few housekeeping items. First, to provide you with the best listening experience, all audio lines except for the host and the presenter will be muted during the webinar. We will not be utilizing the raise hand functionality today. If at any time during the presentation you would like to ask the presenter a question for the Q&A section or add a comment to the discussion, please utilize the Q&A panel on your console. And finally, this presentation is being recorded and will be available to play on demand from both the Scrum at Scale website and the Scrum at Scale YouTube channel within 24 hours. Live viewings and on-demand viewings of Scrum at Scale webinars are eligible for 1 SEU from the Scrum Alliance. All right, and we are now ready to start today's webinar. And for that, I would like to introduce our certified Scrum at Scale trainer, Luiz Quintela, and our certified Scrum at Scale chief product owner and CEO, Carol McEwen. Sorry, Carol.
That's okay.
All right, take it away.
I am a certified practitioner, so that's okay.
You are. Perfect. All right, take it away.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that, Alyssa. And Q, thanks so much for joining us today. We appreciate all the guidance you give us on a very regular basis here.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you. So while we wait for a couple of questions to start coming in, some people did send messages ahead of time. So I'll start with one of those and see what you have to say. Q. So first one, is there a recommended format for the EMT meeting, and might it mirror a backlog refinement or planning meeting?
It depends what you're doing, right? There's no recommended format because Scrum at Scale is not prescriptive, but the whole idea is when you have the EMS come together, they are a team, right? They're the chief product owner, what we call the terminal product owner, is usually an SVP, sometimes even the CEO, depending on the company. And then there are the senior stakeholders, and all these people came together. And they talk like product owners would talk, right? They, at the highest level, they are thinking about vision and initiatives, things very, very high level. And then when this work goes to the teams or groups of teams, you are going more tactical than strategic. And in that case, yeah, they may be doing refinement, they may be doing planning, they may be doing all the things that you normally do at team level or at group of team level. So it depends on the level. At the highest level, it's very strategic. And as you go more to the execution side of the house, which is when you get that strategic thing that's a very, very raw backlog. Sometimes it's like, we have 3 products, this the first product, this the second, this the third one. That's the order of priorities. And then this go to a group that's gonna work out product 1, 2, and 3. That's when you're gonna get more into the tactical side, and that's when you start refining backlogs, planning, and doing that kind of stuff. So it depends on the level. It can be strategic, can be tactical, can be a mix of both, but it all depends. The closer to the team itself, the more tactical it becomes.
Great, thank you. And just for those people who have just joined us too, I wanted to remind everybody that this is a kind of an Ask Me Anything webinar rather than a presentation that Q has prepared for us. So those of you who just joined us, please send in your questions. Next question that has just come in is, we have a number of complex systems such as PLM, where we are developing new capabilities and are also keeping the lights on, supporting users worldwide. Do you recommend having a new development team and a support team, or would you recommend one or more development/support teams that will handle both? The issue is how to handle unexpected maintenance issues that pop up.
Okay, that's actually a great question. And I've been on the receiving end of that multiple times. First as a developer, then as a Scrum Master, and then as a coach, right? I think there is a big tendency to have what some people call a maintenance team over having the so-called development team deal with that. I worked in a company who did a lot of this so-called development team, and it created more problems than it solved. Again, your experience may be different than mine. Like everything we use in Agile, we always have to say it depends. But my personal opinion and my personal experience is the so-called maintenance teams create a lot of problems because it goes down even to branching strategies. You have, especially if you're trying to work on the trunk instead of multiple branches. So I in maintenance teams in 3 of my clients, and none of them had a good experience with that. Again, that may change in your shop. The idea for me is code ownership. It's collective. So when you have multiple teams, or even just a single team, it's a collective thing. Everybody in the team owns code. Everybody in a group of teams in a scrum or scrums owns code. So when there is maintenance issues, the so-called production things, right? Everybody should be able to deal with that. Now, what often happens, and I had a few fights this week on LinkedIn because of that, is that you are going to impact planning because you don't really know how many production issues you're going to have, especially if the teams are new, the system just came out, your quality, it's kind of iffy and all that stuff. So in those cases, a lot of people will recommend that you have what's called an interrupt buffer. Funny thing is I used that for many years and I didn't even know there was a name for it, but basically what you do is you save a chunk of time in your planning, either sprint or multiple sprints if you're planning that far ahead. And that chunk of time should be as big as pretty much the average number of interruptions that you had in the past 3 to 5 sprints. And if you don't know, well, use best guess, right? And that interrupt buffer, it's for things that parachute from production unannounced to be handled with. And the reason you do that is increases the probability that what you think you're going to get done for the sprint to actually happen, because that buffer is already in there to deal with interruptions. So it shouldn't impact what you plan to do. Again, the best plans never survive contact with the enemy, but the buffer exists to add a certain level of predictability and to have the teams deal with things that may come out of nowhere. But the whole idea is what do we do with the buffer if we don't use it? Well, you can always go grab something in a backlog if you're seeing that nothing is happening. And if something comes out of production, just stop on what you got out of the backlog. It was extra work anyway. The thing about the buffer is it enables the product owners to have a certain level of confidence on what is going to happen for each sprint. And product owners require a certain level of confidence and predictability so they can tell the stakeholders and the users when something is coming or close to when it's coming. Again, I'm not trying to waterfall things. I'm just preparing for the imponderable. So committing to the whole sprint and having a separate team do it, it may create more problems than you are willing to deal with. I prefer the interrupt buffer, collective code ownership, and everybody pitches in if there is a problem in production that needs to be addressed. Carol?
Great. Thanks, Q. I appreciate that. So next question. How would you know when your reference model is ready to move forward with implementing Scrum at scale?
That's actually a good question. I mean, it's hard to tell if I don't have my boots on the ground, but think about this, right? When would you move? I mean, when do you consider a team mature, right? All those things, you have to have some sort of thoughts on what constitutes maturity. So I think if you have a reasonable good idea what the velocity of the teams are, you have your EMS working and refining and doing things that EMS does, you have your EAT working and removing impediments and assuring the quality of Scrum, and you think that's good enough to expand, that's the time when you know it. But I mean, I'm not being evasive, but that changes a lot depending on the environment. What I normally do with clients is we decide on a set of criteria. It's sort of a definition of done for the reference model, right? And you go through that checklist and say, okay, I think these items are all good, and we can add a few more teams. I wouldn't also try to do something like you have 3 or 4 teams on a reference model, which is a good, it's a pretty good size, because it's not too small, it's not too large, and you can figure out things really well. And you have another 250 teams here on the side, and then you basically say, okay, it worked for this 4. It will work for the 250 and flip the switch. I would recommend bringing teams or groups of teams gradually, and always analyzing how things are going, you know, always doing a retrospective as you add a few more teams and etc. It's very dangerous to flip switches overnight. So, but again, I would come up with a list of criteria. For me, is if the velocity it's already has a certain level of predictability, the EAT is working, the EMS is working, there is a common backlog, there's no invisible work anywhere, you know, people are familiar with Scrum and Scrum at scale. All these basic things have to be done. And then just keep adding teams, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 at a time. Don't just get to the reference model and throw in a very large number of teams, because there is a lot of stuff that you don't know. And bringing things in a more gradual manner, it's the best way. I don't know if I answered, because it's not easy to answer that question without knowing environmental, corporate policies, how much support you have from the executives, and etc. That should be all taken in consideration too.
Great, thanks, Q. I guess I'll ask this question as well, right? In reference to that, how do you know what next teams to bring in? So in my experience, I've actually seen where some people have said, hey, how come those guys over there are getting all their work done so fast, and how come, like, they're really happy and they seem to be having a lot of fun over there? Can we get on that bandwagon? Is that where you start, or do you start with the next biggest piece of work that you know that needs to, you know, the next team that needs to change because the next team that's not delivering very well?
Absolutely.
So so let's see, how do you plan 2 days of PI meetings on a offshore team meeting with time differences?
Oh, nobody said that was easy, right? Well, first of all, PI is a construct that not belongs in Scrum at scale, right? Scrum at scale is not prescriptive to it. Now, that said, I have multiple clients that, even though they're doing Scrum at scale, they do some what is commonly called as PI planning. I have a little bit of a hard take with some of that, but it's part of maturing. And don't construe this as saying, Q said we don't need to plan, or we don't have to plan, or we shouldn't plan. No, planning is a good thing. I am a bit careful with the word PI planning, because that tends to imply that the teams are committing to things, or they're using a particular framework, and etc. Now, going back to your question, I have had for the past 2 years or so, clients that had teams in multiple places. Actually, I had a client in Denmark, has people in 5 different countries, and they basically fly everybody in to do their planning event. And there was one time I was in town, there were 3 trains doing their planning at the same time, and there was a lot of people involved, about 200 to 300 people in each one of them. So it's expensive to fly people. Yes, it is. I never seen a good solution to do planning at that scale being done remotely. Yeah, you can do in Zoom, you can do it breakout rooms, you can do it even VR rooms. Nureva has some great boards that you can use to do that. But depending on how well people know each other, which sometimes they don't, the remote element of that just exacerbates that the people don't have enough understanding of each other. There's not enough synergy. They never work together. They only know themselves remotely, especially across time zones. I hate to tell you, but flying people to one location, it's the only efficient way that I know. Can you do it remotely? Yes, you can. Now, if you have a 9 or 10 hour time difference, how realistic is to do that too? So when you have remote things, it's probably better to isolate the teams from closer geographical locations, close time zones, in its own scrum of scrums, its own group of team, or its own train, if you want to use safe language, right? And then try to spread them all over into a larger group. So there is no real good way to deal with that. Face-to-face communication in that level of planning is still the best way to do it. I know we have a coronavirus scare right now going around, but I don't know. One of my clients, the next PI planning is end of April. So far, we're planning to fly people in unless the situation changes radically, because we tried in the past and it wasn't very efficient to do it remotely. But I mean, I would exercise some good judgment, maybe run a couple pilots with smaller teams and grouping them by geography or time zone similarity. 1 or 2, maybe 3 hours apart is even doable. And 9 or 10 creates a lot of problems for everybody. So that's the best I can tell you.
Perfect. Thanks, Q. Let's see. I saw one come in through the chat. Some people are putting questions in chat, and I'm going to ask if you could try and put those in the Q&A session rather than chat. It's just easier to keep them all in one spot. But I'll ask this question. Let's see. What is the recommendation when QA resources are outnumbered by the devs output and there starts to be a log jam in delivery plus constant carryover?
Well, I'll give you, that's actually a fun question, because I usually reply to this with my analogy of having a washer and a dryer, right? So people are going to say, okay, I have 3 washers here and have 1 dryer. So I keep feeding stuff in the dryer, then the dryer can't take it anymore, and there's still a lot of stuff that's wet, right? So let's buy another dryer. Okay, then put another dryer in there, right? And then you have enough stuff that the 2 dryers can go. And then you're going to say, well, the washers are just stopped because the the dryer is busy. Okay, so you see how it goes, right? We tend to say maybe we need more people and resources in here, and maybe we need less people and resources in here. So there is a thing called theory of constraints that, if you're not familiar with, you should give it some read. But here's how I normally deal with that. And I had this case came about in one of our coaching sessions, which we have one today at 2 p.m. East Coast time. And somebody asked me the same question, said, well, I have 3 developers and 1 tester. And what happened is the 3 developers pounded the tester at the same time with 3 things, and then the poor soul can't deal with that. Then I thought, did you ever consider explaining to the developers the concept of swarming? And think about this. If the 3 developers worked on something and output just that one something to the person doing the test or test automation, and then went back and went to the next backlog item and worked that together, wouldn't you have a more constant flow through the system? One of the things we have to be very careful is we don't optimize things in a local fashion, which is, oh, let's put more in here or more in there and more in there. You always have to think in a system thinking way. So lean is all about flow, and Scrum uses a lot of lean things. So if you have 3 or 4 people outputting stuff and only 1 person in here testing that thing, you have a big problem in there. You have a flow problem, right? Now, if everybody swarms and creates 1 item and that item goes to test and they move to the next one, you're probably going to have a more uniform flow and things are going to go through the system more fluidly. Otherwise, okay, we have 3 washers and 1 dryer. Okay, let's put 2 dryers there. Oh, okay, now we need 3 dryers. No, but then we need one more washer here because the 3 dryers are not getting enough capacity. And so maybe if we did a smaller load, remember that Lean also talks about small batches. If we need a smaller load on the washer, we had a more uniform flow to the dryer, and the dryer would dry things faster, and then would have a more continuous movement through the system. So swarming is one way to do that. I would take a look at how things are flowing through your system. You know, small batches, which means user stories that are close in size to each other, right? Which creates a better flow too. If you have a story that's massive and it takes a long time and then goes to testing, and then there's three small ones here, you're gonna have flow problems again. If you split that big one and they're all about the same size, it flows a lot better to the system. So small batches and swarming are 2 things that can help you out with this.
Great. Okay, another question. Let's see, let's pick this one. I am a Scrum Master and I'm about to start a series of projects where for the first time, we'll have a joint backlog, dev teams plus UX UI teams plus DevOps teams. My question is, how can we estimate the entire backlog as a whole when these teams have dedicated people and specific requirements, user stories? How can we come to a definition of a reference for us to an agreement on what one story point is?
Okay, well, first of all, congratulations, because you're moving to a single backlog. That's a major step, and that's a must do. Now, the rest of the question, I'm not even gonna say it depends, and for one reason. I don't have my boots on the ground. It's very difficult for a coach to say, well, a 1 is this. I really don't know. Perhaps you need the help of a coach locally to get everybody in the room and try to figure out what's the minimum amount of work that constitutes a 1. I don't know. I mean, for some teams, a 1, it's a method in a class, if you're talking C++ parlance. So that takes, between writing the method and writing the unit testing and writing the stuff, it takes a couple minutes, you know. It's usually takes 6 to 8 minutes to write a method, and about the same amount of, actually half the time to do a unit test and all that stuff. So 1 is something that takes 15 minutes, right? In that case, but it can be something else. Now, if you're gonna study UI and UX, that may involve a lot of early prototyping before that thing even goes to the developer's hands, right? So I would engage a coach and have everybody in the room together and try to come up with this. That's not an answer I can give you right here, right now. I don't have my boots on the ground. Anything I said would be actually very, very dangerous. So sorry, I can't answer that one.
Is it necessary, Q, for every team to use the same story point?
Nor they should, actually. You know, for a long time, SAFe used to prescribe that you have to normalize points. Carol, you probably remember that, right?
I do, yes.
And that was one of the biggest criticisms, because people estimate things differently, right? And what one team says is 3 points, the other team may basically say it's 5. It doesn't mean that one team is right, one team is wrong, right? They just estimate different. And in the end, getting the work done and getting the work completed in the sprint and obeying a definition of done and turning output into outcome is what matters. How people necessarily estimate stuff, it's not really relevant, right? And especially when you have a group of teams, which is the case when you scale. If you were to compare estimates, which is a total no, please don't ever do that, the same way you don't compare velocities, right? You would incur on some massive problems because just people think of things differently. What you have to have is inside the team an agreement on what those numbers are. In the group of teams is not really relevant because everybody is going to estimate their piece of the pie. And then you can just say, well, given the velocity of our group of being, I don't know, 1,500 points, and we have, I don't know, 3,000 points to do, well, that's probably about 2 sprints for the groups to do it. There are people who came to me and with very sophisticated Excel models on how to aggregate estimates and points. For Christ's sake, just add an average, the whole thing, you know, that's as easy as it is, because they are all different. The same way velocities are different, estimates are different. What you have to have is an agreement inside the team and not necessarily inside the group. Normalizing points, it's a very bad idea.
Great. So back to the last question is maybe it's not so necessary that even, you know, your different teams really don't have to have an agreement. It's really making sure that each team understands how they're estimating their points so that the velocity within the team can become more predictable.
Exactly. It's
Great.
Predictability within the team. So it gets more predictable between the group of teams, and the chief product owner knows what to tell the stakeholders and the users, right?
Yep.
So it's about being predictable, you know, and trying to normalize things. I would still recommend a coach to harmonize this with the team so everybody gets the same message.
Absolutely.
And if you can do this as a Scrum Master, you know, if you have the bandwidth to go talk to all these teams and tell the same thing, so they all understand this message, yeah, by all means.
Great. So I'm going to ask another question that came in that is about story points as well. So assigning story points helps the Scrum team, but from a management perspective, story points does not allow us to determine whether we will meet the deadline. What can be done to overcome this challenge? Hopefully some of the conversation from the last question will help on this, but.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's true, Carol. There is some of the previous conversation, but I think the way you tell management to track whether or not they're going to make a deadline is to check a burn down or a burn up chart, right? Where are you trending, you know? And you have to be very careful with that deadlines don't become an excuse to drop quality. Many years ago, when I was a developer, you know, and then I run development groups, I had VPs of development come to me and say, Q, what can we drop to release by 1 April, right? The answer to that is quality. Actually, the answer to that is not, oh, let's drop some testing. We don't need to do integration testing anyway. And apparently Boeing did that really well with their Starliner capsule that didn't reach orbit because they had some testing things that apparently got dropped, right? So I think one way to see how you are trending towards a release, it is to have a burn down or a burn up chart, you know, to be monitoring that chart on a daily basis. After the Scale Daily Scrum is the time to figure out how things are going, right? Because people are updating where they are in a particular sprint. And you have to be prepared to understand that a release plan is just more a roadmap than a plan, because there are lots of things when you start working that may show up and they will impact the plan, you know, including coronavirus lately. You know, I mean, people just, they have to work from home, and then working from home, they may not get as much work done, or there are VPN problems. There are all sorts of things that can happen, and that will cause problems. So I would say management should be monitoring the release progress at least once a sprint after the sprint review, right? I would do it daily and be prepared to drop scope if you think you're not going to meet it. Points don't translate to management. You're absolutely right. Now, a burn up or burn down chart, something that shows the status towards completing by a certain date or a certain scope, it's perfectly doable. I would always go scope instead of date, but people tend to need dates for some reasons, but be prepared that if you don't drop scope, the quality will. And then we all get into technical debt, which makes things even slower. And we know the rest of the story, right, Carol?
We sure do. Okay, let's see what else is coming here. would you speak to what type of topics and conversations would be appropriate for a meta scrum? And what technical topic would be appropriate, if any?
For a meta scrum, I don't see why you would be discussing technical topics. I mean, technical topics is a bit vague, right? But if you are talking executive meta scrum, for instance, I doubt, at least in ours, I never seen anybody discussing technical topics there, unless somebody says, well, we need to do a platform upgrade because it's gonna make our life easier and etc. But for the product owners, they need to know basically is the reasons to do that and how important it is to do it. They're not gonna be discussing the merits of doing it, you know. Or for instance, we're gonna go Azure or AWS. For the product owners is, we need to move to the cloud, right? I mean, they definitely won't get into that. Now, when you go to more team level, which wouldn't be the meta scrum, it's, the discussions may get technical because the team members are going to have technical discussions, but I don't see product owners in general, the executive level or just meta scrum level in the group of teams, be thoroughly included in technical discussions or even caring about it. They have to understand what the implications are, and that's true of everything, and technical debt is one of the reasons, right? They make sure that by doing this, you don't create more technical debt, and they understand those consequences. But at least in my experience, I never seen a product owner discussing technical things. Now, for the meta scrum, again, I said this in the beginning, depends on the level, if it's executive or not, if you're going to be purely strategic or you're going to delve more in the tactical side. So the closer to the team you get, the more tactical it gets. And the closer to the executive level you get, the more strategic it gets. Carol?
Great, thank you. Let's see, trying to make sure I don't ask something that's already been asked. Let's see, here's a great one. Okay, my executive says our Scrum Masters are not effective. They are not driving the team enough, drive as a conventional project manager would do. How should I answer this, these concerns in a way that my executive can understand?
Well,
they would rather, dang, and there's another piece of this. They would rather have the Scrum Master who can push a little to the product owner and dev team and report things promptly. I mean, having few elements from conversation of PM.
Well, I think your management needs to understand what the job of a Scrum Master is. You know, the role entitles some things, right? And if I were to have a PM in there, why do I even need Scrum, right? I mean, PMs used to do everything, what the product owner does, what the Scrum Master does, and then a certain other thing. So I think the first thing, and that's very common actually, is to explain what a Scrum Master do. Now, once you explain what a Scrum Master is supposed to do, and the Scrum Master is not doing it, that's a completely different story, right? So I would say there's two things to do there. One is to explain to management what the role of the Scrum Master is. And second, assert that the Scrum Master is actually performing his or her role properly, right? If a Scrum Master, all they do is to set up the meetings and that's about it, I can get an admin to do that for a lot less money, right? So I think it's always twofold. Do management understand what the Scrum Master's job is? And are the Scrum Masters really performing their job description according to the Scrum Guide? So I don't know, I don't have my boots on the ground, but are they asking that because they want somebody to check box and etc.? That's not what Scrum Master does. So they need to understand the role. Now, are they complaining that the teams are not ramping up velocity? There's a lot of technical debt and all that stuff. And the Scrum Master is not asking questions. That's another issue, right? So I would ask, do they understand the role? Yes or no? If not, we have to educate them. If they understand the role, are the Scrum Masters performing the role? Carol?
Fantastic. I'm getting a lot of thank yous, and you're answering questions to help me. So just want to make sure that if anybody has any other questions, we've got about just about 4 or 5 minutes left here. So I do have another one that came in. From an accountability perspective, accountability usually held by a single person. Where in a Scrum at Scale implementation does the accountability for the release lie?
The release is the Scrum at Scale. The accountability for the quality of Scrum resides with the AT. In the Scrum at Scale guide, there is nothing that says where the accountability for a release lies. But in my book, particularly my own interpretation of this, a release is a release is tactical and is also strategic. Is a product owner, but is also a Scrum Master thing, right? So the Scrum of Scrum's Master, Chief Scrum Master, or whatever you want to call it, and the Chief Product Owner, Product Manager, and whatever you want to call it, I think they hold joint responsibility, because from the product side, if you want to do a release, you have to make sure the backlog gets ready, prepared, refined, in order so the teams can actually execute that backlog, right? Now, from the Scrum Master side, if the product owner team is providing all the stuff that you need in the backlog to be working with, it's on the Scrum Master side, which would be the Scrum of Scrum's Master, to coordinate with the other Scrum Masters. Bear in mind, there's no hierarchy between the Scrum Masters, right? They just work in a team. To coordinate with them and make sure that they are implementing tactically and operationally what came from the product owner side. So it's a joint responsibility, and that's why the two structures, they have to talk to each other, right? There's the Scrum Master cycle, there's the product owner cycle, and they should connect at one point and talk to each other. So it doesn't matter how good your teams are if there is no backlog to work on. It doesn't matter how good your backlog is if the teams are not performing at the best, or the Scrum Masters are not making sure the teams have what they need to perform at their best. So it's a joint responsibility between the Chief Product Owner and the Scrum of Scrum's Master. Carol, if we have time, we can, if we have more questions, we can extend another 10 minutes. It's up to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, we do have some more questions, so that would be fantastic. Let's see. Are there any suggestions for the best way to conduct program demos? Currently, my company is showcasing user acceptance testing to stakeholders and deciding if the work should be released or not, but perhaps there are more effective ways.
You know, that's a good question. I could go on for the next 3 hours about this.
We don't have that long, Q.
I don't. And Scrum at Scale is going to announce a surprise about product ownership in about a month, but I'm not going to say anything, otherwise Carol kills me, right? But we are very focused, and I had so many questions about product ownership in the past 6 to 8 months in this webinars that I did, that we decided to do something about it. So stay tuned. In April, you're going to know what I'm talking about. But back to your question. The best way in my mind is, and I'm a big fan of always repeating, output versus outcome, output versus outcome, output versus outcome. So testing user acceptance, to me, it's mandatory. Obviously, the users have to test it, and you have to have several layers of testing. But when you demo a product, you have to demo from the point of view of outcome. What's the outcome of the user? Okay, I had this discussion multiple times with developers. They are too preoccupied with how many things they output during the sprint. Well, I'm more preoccupied is what outcome I'm going to have to the customer receiving of that. And it doesn't need to be software, it can be anything. Scrum is used to do just about everything. So when I do a demo, I highlight the outcome and not the output. So I wouldn't necessarily use a usability test to do a demo. I would demo from the perspective of outcomes. For instance, if you are selling mortgages, right? Well, there's the changes we made in the last 6 sprints provided this outcome here, which is when they get to the site, they can apply to the mortgage with only 3 clicks or something like that. And this compared to the old system, it saves them about half an hour of their time and etc. So you don't need to show every nook and cranny of the system to say what the outcome is for the user. So I am known for cutting demo times and sprint review times because stakeholders don't have a lot of time. You don't invite a VP for a 5-hour sprint review, which I've seen some of those happen more than I would like to report. But so they want to know is outcome. If you say, okay, what is the user getting from this? They're wasting less time. They're getting what they want faster. That's what you should demo, and that doesn't take a lot to demo. Don't get into the trap of, okay, let me do the whole user acceptance test thing as a demo. That's probably going to be relatively long, and you may lose the perspective of the outcome because I think you're focusing too much on the output. You have to think that the least amount of output that products the maximum amount of outcome, that's what matters. So think about showing outcomes, not outputs.
Great, thanks, Q. Let's see, how can a project manager perform the role of a Scrum Master effectively?
A project manager? Well, first of all, is he or she still a project manager? Well, if they are, then we have a conflict of interest in there. There's actually not even a conflict. It's a conflict of methodologies, of understanding of the frameworks, right? Now, I had in
so
the
past, short answer would be no. They can't,
no,
right?
They can't. Now they can transition to being a Scrum Master. Yes, I had people in the past who did that, sure. And I also had PMs in the past that transition to be product owners. They can't do both things. It doesn't exist.
Right.
Next.
Thank you. Do you have any recommendations on how to fit UI UX into scaled Scrum teams? Should they be working 2 weeks ahead? Should they be embedded in the team? And how can they make time to research additional design if devs are coding at the same time?
I've seen it done both ways. I've seen it done as a separate team, which has the inconvenience of creating a dependency, right? Because you have to synchronize it. And I've seen it done with people embedded in the teams. Now, so I also would recommend that during the time you're doing discovery, which is before you even created a backlog, perhaps you should prototype some of those things, maybe concierge demos. There's many things you can do, and get yourself a bit ahead, then decide on the UI just when you're going to pull the user story, and then you're going to work on it. You see, it's all about experimentation. And one of the reasons we do product inceptions or discovery, I think people calling it both ways, is to get some more understanding of the thing. So normally, I would try to do as many UI UX as possible during the inception and present that to usability labs, present that to users and etc., and just refine it a little bit. Now, if you have a lot of UI UX, you're probably going to be best served with a separate team, but you're going to create a dependency. Now, the separate team has a lot more bandwidth to go and do usability labs, concierge tests, and all that stuff before they come to a closer understanding of what the UI will be for that user experience. So I think it's done both ways. Depends a lot of how complex your UI UX is, how many teams you have. I would try to do as much as possible during the discovery part, and not so much when you are already with the train outside of the station, right?
So a quick question to that then, Q. Would that mean that you would put the discovery into part of your backlog at the team level?
Yes, you would. You do the discovery before. During the discovery, you're going to create an initial backlog, right?
Right.
And a lot of people, what they do is they try to do a lot of the UI UX during that phase. And discovery can, a lean inception takes a week, right? But some inception, some discoveries go for like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, right?
Yeah.
And you can do a lot of the UI upfront in there. Now, bear in mind that UI in general, UX to be more generic, like user experience, it takes a lot of experimentation, right? So I think a lot of people think that, oh, we have this design and then we go to sprint review and everybody approves it. Not in my experience. I mean, sometimes when people see stuff during the sprint review, they either love it or they hate it, and which is perfectly fine, right? Because it's about having the iteration during that time. So I've seen companies do both ways. I've seen have them embedded. I've seen them doing as a separate team.
Great. So we have 3 more minutes. I have 2 more questions. So I'm just going to give you that cue so that we can queue up the time box here. I see a lot of times that developers are against test-driven development. Is it due to the lack of experience or because they are annoyed it takes time? What do you recommend?
I don't know. I just taught a CSD class, Certified Scrum Developer class, back in December. I think it's both. A lot of people don't understand the value of it, and a lot of people are annoyed because of the time it takes. We have to be careful with unit testing and test-driven development, etc., that we don't go write tests for empty constructors and things of the sort. I've seen that, right? And then I had people saying, well, we have 45,000 unit tests. And I told them, what are you testing? And they couldn't answer to me. So the 45,000 unit tests were taking, I believe, close to an hour to run. I said, well, don't you guys think that it's causing a little bit of bottleneck, right? Because if you want to build something really quick to test, and you're going to have to wait an hour and a half. So maybe you do a subset during the day and then do the full suite overnight, right? The thing is, don't get too much into it that you're going to create a bottleneck. But I think the most times, test-driven development and behavior-driven development, which I personally like much better, are things that a lot of developers don't understand, don't know it properly, and they think it's just a waste of time. It isn't. But you also have to make sure you don't create a massive bottleneck with a massive suite that runs on every build. You should just run a subset and then do the full build overnight or once or twice a day, something like that.
Perfect, thank you. And the last question for today. Who should do the product demo? Is it the Scrum Master, the product owner, or developers who worked on the stories?
That comes quite a bit. I will tell you one thing. All these 3 roles that you mentioned right now, they are people in a team. So who should do the demo? The person who does demos the best. Okay. If you have a Scrum Master that's a good demoer, go for it. Now, I would recommend you don't show code snippets. I had one team once that said, oh, you see, we just gained a lot of time because we went to this query, they popped the query. There were 6 outer joints there. And now the query is rewritten like this. There's no outer joints. And everybody in the room is sleeping by there, right? Now, it would be great if they did the demo like this. 2 web pages. This was the query before. Spinning, 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 spinning. This is the query after. Boom, result. So I would say, go get somebody who demos outcome and not output. I don't care if the Scrum Master, the tester, the developer, the product owner, the BA in the team. It's irrelevant whose team member it is. Get the best person to do the demo. And I would also do sort of my joke, pair programming for demo. Make sure that the good demoer teaches other people how to do demos. Remember, we all have to be T-shaped. We all have to be cross-functional. So it doesn't matter who does the demo as long as a good demo and is done from the point of view of outcome and not output. That's it.
So one situation I ran into, I actually saw a team that they requested that the customer come in and do the demo.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really fantastic too. So
that's great.
Keep in mind, I agree, it doesn't matter who it is, it's find the one that does the best one. So Q, I want to thank you and for the time that you've spent. Again, we've got a lot of people saying thank you, Q, thank you, Q. So Alyssa, we'll ask you to come back in and wrap us up.
All right, perfect. Awesome. So I wanted to thank you, Carol and Q, for hosting today's presentation, and to all of the attendees that were able to join and ask so many amazing questions. As I noted at the beginning of the presentation, the recording of today's webinar will be available on our website within about 24 hours. Also, if you would like to follow up with Q with any additional questions, his information can be found on the trainer directory at scrumatscale.com. And you can also find links to register for future webinars, information on the virtual coaching sessions that Q had mentioned, and search for virtual and in-person Scrum at Scale practitioner courses. All right, and that's all that I have. Carol, Q, do you have any last words?
No, I thank everybody who came. It's always fun. You guys gave me a bunch more ideas for future webinars, and we'll be doing more.
Perfect.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks,
guys.
everybody.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a good day.
Bye.